What follows is a free-form dialogue about change and momentum and humility that I have somewhat scrambled together after realizing I completely effed up the episode that I had already recorded. But it turns out that effing up that episode is a good thing in the end, because it was crappy, and this one, if not better, is at least somewhat more authentic. It's going to be short, it's going to be weird, it's going to be a little bit different. I hope, however, that you get something from it anyways. And we'll get to it on the other side. Hello, you're listening to the John Huff Podcast. Oh, yay. Did you ever feel yourself on the cusp of change? I feel as though I'm on the cusp of change. That is an amorphous kind of feeling. That is not something easily defined. That's not something particularly tangible. It's just, you kind of wake up and you got this feeling in your bones, this feeling around you that there's just change coming. Not even necessarily that there's change coming, but that there needs to be change coming. I'm going to warn you now that I'm about to talk in circles for an as of yet undetermined amount of time because I've done the sort of thing that as a podcaster, as a professional, you're not really supposed to do, which is I've recorded an entire episode about a band and then realized after it was all said and done that I had been saying the name of the band incorrectly. And you know what? There was a point in time when I would have encountered that grave error and it would have just wrecked my whole life. Like I would have gone down a crazy existential rabbit hole about how terrible I am at this and what an oversight that was and what a waste of time this all is anyways. And this is the proof. This is the evidence that I should just quit and throw it away. And I would, throw my toys out the pram and walk out the door and be convinced that I am nothing more than an enormous loser and failure. But you know what I did? I had it in the back of my head. I was thinking about something. I was taking a break from editing. And then I looked down at my phone to see the video I was talking about. And I realized in looking at it that I had been saying the name of the band wrong, like entirely wrong. And instead of freaking out, I burst out laughing. And one of the reasons I burst out laughing is because I had a sense that this episode didn't work anyhow. I had been trying real hard, all right? I had been trying real hard to infuse it with some relevance and value. But the truth is, over the past week or so, I have just been really busy and distracted and tired and working on stuff. And I didn't have a lot of time to really dig into something. And so it felt to me as though I were, let's say, manufacturing an episode. But this is only an example, just a bit of evidence to support a broader feeling of change, maybe imminent and perhaps necessary, not just in the podcast, but in life more generally. I am approaching my 50th birthday, and for somebody like me who tends to be introspective and existential and got caught up in milestones and that kind of thing, I greatly envy people, by the way, who are not like that, but I am like that, chronic overthinker and perpetually caught up in these sorts of milestones and whatever, constantly reflecting, and 50 is coming. And so it's natural for somebody like me to be approaching that milestone and looking back upon my life and there's a ship on the ocean and I can't decide if I like it. Who gets that reference? Anybody? Free 10 points to you. It's not about turning 50. There might be some veneer of that. Like maybe subconsciously I'm closing in on a bit of a milestone and here's the opportunity to reflect. It's not really that. I'm not approaching 50 the way I approached 40, which was with great trepidation because I had felt at that point in my life I was getting nowhere, accomplishing nothing. Nothing was working. It was just an endless, perpetual mess of me trying stuff and it not working out. And I was putting a lot of pressure on myself, and I felt as though I was turning 40 and I should have accomplished X, Y, and Z. And instead, I screwed it up and I was fumbling, tumbling into my 40s, just way behind, man. And now I'm tumbling into my 50s and fundamentally nothing has changed. Still trying things that aren't working, still feeling as though I'm not getting anywhere. And the difference now is that I am way less existentially wrapped up in that. Part of that is the consequence of COVID. It's a consequence of the pandemic and how I had an ego breakdown during the pandemic. I had an anxiety breakdown that really shook me, man. It shook me to the core. And part of the lesson was to lose a lot of my ego attachments, and my ego attachments, a lot of them were tied to feelings of accomplishment, feelings of success, being recognized to have been successful, being identified with the character of a person called John Huff, who is a drummer and tours or has a blog, whatever it was at the time. These attachments to being somebody. And I held tightly to those attachments all through my 40s. And then a pandemic came that shook me to the core and told me, stop identifying with being someone. And to a large extent, I have done that. Not entirely. Last night at pickleball, I'm playing badly and I'm getting angry about it and I'm getting mad at myself about it, still attached to the identity of someone who is competent at pickleball. These things creep into your day-to-day existence. But as I approach my 50s, I do not feel the same attachment to being someone, all right? There's still areas in which that pops up in my life, and it's more cleaning that I have to do. It's more curriculum that I have to pass. But I think this impending sense of change that I have is not really about reaching a milestone birthday. I think it's just a sense of energy. I think it's just me feeling around at what I am kind of forcing, things that I am efforting at. That's a big word in the New Age spiritual movement. This notion of efforting. It's not the same as putting in effort on things. It's not the same as working hard. It's efforting, it's struggling, it's striving. And I have felt at times with the podcast lately, like maybe I'm efforting, And the episode that I recorded that I am not going to release because of a big screw up felt like an efforting kind of episode. As I was editing it, it was like, I don't feel the energy in this. It feels a bit forced, like I'm not exactly going through the motions, but it's like I'm feeling a pressure on myself to put out an episode because, it's Wednesday. And not really having a lot to say and then trying to shoehorn in some stuff. It felt like not a great episode as I was recording it, and then as I was editing it, it also felt like not a great episode. And it had me reflecting on, are any of the episodes I'm doing these days all that great? And it's not to say they are or they aren't, but it takes me back to examine the energy of the program. And is the energy of the program flowing? Is it growing? Does it seem to be going in the direction it wants to go? And I've had to really wrestle with that. And I constantly wrestle with, is this better as an interview show? Does it better serve the listenership as an interview show? Is it what I want to do? Are the solo episodes what I want to do? Is there a better balance I can do between that? What does the show want to be? And so I'm wrestling with this over time, and I do this episode, and it doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel like a great episode. And so I get through it anyways because, you got to put out the content. You can't miss a week, man. This is the arbitrary pressure that I put on myself because that's the best practice. Stick to your publication schedule, which incidentally is what I'm doing at this moment. Kind of last minute, out of necessity. Do this episode, doesn't feel right as I'm doing it. I think sometimes it happens. Sometimes you feel as though the energy wasn't there, but then you go back and you listen to it as you edit, and you're like, it was better than I thought. It worked okay, it's fine. But as I'm editing this one, I'm like, you know what? It still doesn't feel right. And do I do you, the listeners of the show, a disservice by releasing that? Or is it more valuable for you, even if the episode's not that great, to have one as opposed to not have one? So I'm wrestling with that. Like, what do I do here? And then, as I'm wrestling, I look down at my phone, at the video in question, and I'm like, is that what the band's called? Did I call the band something else throughout that whole episode? And then I had to kind of run over to my computer and pull up the file and listen. And it's like, yeah, I was calling the band the wrong name through the whole freaking episode. And then I burst out laughing. Why? Because this is just the universe confirming. This is not a great episode, Jack. Don't release it. It's just like this way of saying, yeah, you need to look at some of these questions that you've had in your mind about the podcast. Is it serving in the way that it could best? Is the format right? And is this last episode you've done not great? Well, you know what? We're going to kill it by having screwed up all the way through it. And so I laughed. And this is a big change. There was a point in time when that just would have killed me. Like, I just would have kicked over the desk, Like, what am I doing this for? And the same question pops up. What am I doing this for? But I can look at it now in a more rational and a more gentle way and in a more open way. And so I don't know the answers to any of the questions. I just know that I still want to put out an episode for you this week, and I can be a little bit honest about what happened. So here's what happened. I was doing my watch list for last week so I could do the click show. Go back to the last episode. I'll tell you what the click show is. And I happened upon a song that I really, really loved. Again, that's not an every week kind of a thing. That's a rare thing. And it's a song called Kisses by this band Slowdive, all right? Now, I did a whole history of Slowdive, and there is one. This is a band. They're a shoegaze band, a dream pop band that showed up in Britain in the late 80s, early 90s. And they had this brief window of time where shoegaze was happening. I did a whole explanation of shoegaze. Fundamentally, shoegaze music is about soundscapes, all right? It goes back to the new wave stuff we talked about, goth stuff we talked about, really chorusy, reverby, effects-laden guitars, and vocals that are also kind of effects-laden. A lot of shimmery guitars over top of bass lines and drums that kind of drive the melodies and the foundations of these songs. And then these textures, it can be almost trance-like, very emotional, very evocative. I've not listened to a lot of shoegaze music. My Bloody Valentine, I think, is kind of held up as the model shoegaze band. And the reason they called it shoegaze, and it was kind of a derisive term, actually, like critics came along and dismissed what was going on as shoegaze. And that term comes from all of the effects on the guitar. So you go see one of these bands live, and they're not performing for you. They're anti-performance. They're so busy working the pedals to get the guitar sounds, they're literally gazing at their shoes the whole show, tapping pedals, hitting different effects, not even paying attention to the audience. And the whole concept behind this was we are anti-performance. This came along kind of at the peak or just post-peak of the glam metal scene, where everything was performance and shows and Tommy Lee's drum set spinning around and pyro and spandex and lights and smoke and the whole thing. Big show, big visual, right? We know the grunge movement was to a certain extent anti-performance in that way. And shoegaze was that too. Like, you're going to come to the show, the performers aren't going to do anything. They're just going to play the shows, play the music, and they're going to be looking at their feet, gazing at their shoes to make sure they're stepping on the right pedals at the right time. This was the shoegaze thing. And this band Slowdive was a huge, huge part of that scene. They released a couple records in the early 90s, had some success, did some touring, did some big festivals, had a following, had some relative radio hits in this little window in the early 90s before grunge came and Britpop came and kind of took over the popular music scene at that point. And so this was like a cult band, and they had a lot of fans. And then they broke up mid-90s and did other things, and then returned in the kind of 20-teens, popped up at a festival, everybody went nuts, started releasing new music, and they released this song in the last week or so called Kisses, and the band is Slowdive, and it is one of these darkly beautiful, new wave, trancey, ambient shoegaze songs. I've never listened to this kind of music, particularly back in the day, but even now, I have not listened to a lot of it. So if you are a person who is of my vintage and you were into The Cure and this kind of music back in the day, then Slowdive was part of that scene, and now they are back. And this song, Kisses, just really grabbed me by the face in the same way that Jenny Lewis grabbed me by the face last week. This time it was Slowdive. And so I came in kind of shoehorning that content into an episode, repeatedly calling the band Slowdive. And that is potentially a consequence of the 50 thing, because I find my eyesight failing dramatically. And so if I'm looking at something on my phone, the little print on YouTube, I can easily get Slowdive out of Slowdive because I can't freaking see anymore. It's blurry, man. And so you encounter it that way, and it just goes into your brain that the band is called Slowdive, and you keep calling them that, and then thank the freaking universe, which has a sense of humor, kids. It let me dangle out there for a while. It did not let me publish the episode. Now, I knew deep down inside it was not a great episode. The universe knew it too, and let me go far enough to just pulling back from the edge of publishing that episode, saying the name of the band wrong the whole freaking time. So, haha, let's have a big laugh about it all, kids. I did encounter this song, Kisses by Slowdive, and I really, really love it. It's ethereal, it's dark, it's still poppy though, like it's mid-tempo. You could dance to it if you're allowed to dance at a shoegaze show. I don't know. But it's got such a beautiful, gentle vocal line on it. I mean, these songs are not super dynamic in terms of melody, but what they are is really emotive and evocative in terms of soundscape. And I'm a person who likes to become immersed in a song. And I've said before that one of my, not exactly guilty pleasures, but not really talked about pleasures, is dark electronic music. Dark wave, chill wave, this kind of stuff. I'm not like a huge everyday listener, but I once in a while like to dig into one of these dark electronic songs. And this reminds of that. It has that kind of dark, beautiful vibe to it. Shimmery, chorusy guitars, creating atmospheric effect over a bass line that is melodic. And then the vocals have that kind of, the word dour comes to mind. It's not right, but the vocals are a bit gloomy, bit dark. It's not a goth song. It's a shoegaze song. There's a difference. But I just love it. I just love this song, Kisses by Slowdive, and I did this whole not great episode about it that the universe crushed, and then I'm coming along and doing this one instead. And it's going to be a short one because it has to be, because it's Tuesday afternoon and this has to go out Wednesday morning. What I'm going to tell you is I really love that tune, and I did not want to let the week go by without talking about it. Slowdive, Kisses, I will put that on the playlist as ever. Spotify, John Huff Podcast, referenced on the podcast 2023 playlist. Also on YouTube, I have the same. If you go to my account, John Huff Podcast, referenced on the podcast 2023, I put the videos there of the songs that I talked about. The Slowdive video will be there. And it's just really interesting. You know, I don't know if you felt yourself in the way that I do on the cusp of change. I feel certain things, if not ending, then shifting. I mean, the pandemic utterly changed music, and it utterly changed what I was doing in music. And that's not really recovered for me. I am performing, I am playing. I played a couple gigs last weekend. I'm playing with some different acts, some different artists. It's fun and it's cool. I don't know now that it has the potential that I hoped it had in 2019. Things have just changed. You know, if you're in the music world, you know how hard it is to tour now. You know how hard it is even to book shows. Like in our town, something like 6 venues disappeared during COVID, and important ones for indie bands and local bands. And the landscape has just changed. And I've been holding on in a certain sense to how I hoped it would be. I'm learning to let go of that because circumstance just makes it so. But I've just felt like I need to change the way I'm working out now. Like my body is not the same as it used to be. Like there needs to be a change. And there may need to be a change in this podcast because things, to a certain extent, with what I'm doing here, with what I'm doing beyond here, even in drumming, I've felt a certain staleness creeping in. And when you feel a staleness creeping in, that's a clue. It is a signal that you perhaps need to look at changing things in order to create new momentums. I have felt a distinct lack of momentum in various aspects of my life. And then I felt that staleness creeping into the episode that I'm junking. And the universe junked it for me in the end. And there's something for me, there's something very symmetrical in that. There's a sign in that yeah, you need to explore some of the misgivings you've got. Doesn't mean I'm junking the entire podcast, but it does have me stepping back and saying, well, okay, if this feels stale, where does it want to go? You know, what does it want to do from here? And I have to consider that very carefully. Now, I can tell you that this morning, this is Hot Tuesday, this morning, I conducted a magnificent conversation with our old friend, Emily Dolan Davies. Emily was a guest on episode 21 of this program. She is absolutely a magnificent drummer, a magnificent inspiration, a magnificent human being. I'm delighted to consider Emily a friend at this point in time. And she was on our show 4 years ago, and so much has happened, good and bad, since then. And she returns. She will return. I suspect I'm going to do this interview in 2 parts. It was a long one. And her part 1 of that is likely to appear next week. And it's a really enormously inspiring and fun and energetic conversation with an inspiring, energetic, fun human being, which is Emily. And it's like, I feel the momentum in that. You know, I feel like maybe the show wants to go back in that direction a little bit. And I've had some ideas in the back of my mind about how I might expand that and what I might do with it and where the energy might want to go. And I feel a certain amount of excitement. I feel a certain amount of curiosity and excitement about that. And I may or may not do it. It's just things to contemplate. And then I'm thinking about, how can I change my workout so that it's more effective and my body doesn't hurt? What do I want to do as a drummer? Coming down, sitting behind my kit, where does the energy want to go? It's very easy to get stuck in a rut, stuck in a pattern. This is the stuff I always play, and so I will continue to play that. This is the way I always work out, so I'll continue to work out that way. This is the way my podcast format is, and so I will hold on to that like grim death, because it's got to be. But does it? I ask this of myself. I ask this of you, gentle listener. Where in your life are you losing the momentums? And what does it mean? I mean, if you're like me, the temptation is to sense that momentum losing and then feel in some way like you're screwing it up, like you're failing in some weird way, and then to get really upset about that, instead of approaching these feelings with a certain amount of curiosity, and then having the humility to follow them where they lead if that's not really where you felt like you wanted to go. There's a part of me that holds on very tightly, that attaches very tightly to this identity as a person who does solo podcast episodes. And that is what I listen to, and that is what I like to do. But the question is the value there? Or is the value in the interviews? I mean, I've been going around in circles about this. I don't know the answer, but the thing is, I need to be humble enough and open enough to explore that and find the momentums in it and follow where they lead, not to strengthen my attachments, but to let the thing breathe, to let the show, to let my playing, to let whatever it is in my life, my occupation, whatever it is I'm focusing on, allow these things to breathe and have a certain faith that if you do that, they will arrive at their most full potential. That faith for me is difficult. I find it very, very tough to allow things in that way. And that's my curriculum. All right. I talk a lot about curriculum. I talk about it because this was the language that Ram Dass used, about having this incarnation, about coming into this life with lessons to learn. And that is the curriculum that's set before you. So for me, this curriculum has been largely about attachments. My experience in music has been a battleground about attachments. Attachments to artists, attachments to being perceived in a certain way, attachments to whatever it is. And they have been painful, man. They have induced gallbladder attacks. The curriculum for me is attachment. And so I become attached to doing the podcast a certain way, or I become attached to whatever. And it's just clipping those and letting them go. Maybe your curriculum is anger. Maybe your curriculum is being a people pleaser. Maybe your curriculum is having judgments on people. Who knows what it is? But it keeps popping up over and over and over until you begin to learn those lessons and move to the next level of your curriculum. And so when you find out that you wrecked your podcast episode, instead of freaking out and going down an existential rabbit hole about what's the point of it anyway, you have graduated to a certain point in your curriculum where you can laugh about it and say, okay, message heard, point taken. I'm going to junk that episode. And then I'm going to come on here and be a little bit honest with something that isn't necessarily manufactured. This is coming right off the cuff, man. It's just coming out of me to whatever end. And hopefully that's a more useful episode. And I'm going to contemplate how to move the podcast forward from here. There's other stuff going on behind the scenes that will have an effect on it, potentially. Right? There's stuff happening that I'm not talking about yet. And I don't know what that's going to mean. I don't know what's going to mean for my life. I don't know what's going to mean for this show. But what I do know is that we now have an episode in the world that calls Slowdive instead of Slow Drive. And isn't that Isn't that small thing enough? Isn't that enough for 1 week, kids? I am going to cut this episode off here, and it feels extraordinarily unnatural to me to do that. I have become attached to the 50 minutes to an hour thing. And maybe that's too long, maybe that's a lesson here, something that needs to be contemplated. Well, this is just over half an hour, and I wanted to give you something at least to keep whatever momentum we have going just a little bit. Want you to know I'm still here. I haven't forgotten about you. I just freaking screwed up. It up. And there is a wonderful synchronicity in that screw up. Go and listen to Slowdive's Kisses. Really, really great emotive song. Really, really enjoy it. It's one of my favorites of the year so far. Was not expecting that by the thumbnail, by the way. It's just a little intuitive thing. This is what happens. I scroll through, I see new stuff. I get a nudge that says put that on the list or don't, and I do. This one said put it on the list, and I did. And bang, I got myself one of my favorite songs of the year. I'm going to go now. I'm not even going to do the Patreon plug, except to say patreon.com/JohnHuffPodcast if you were inclined to support the show, even after hearing this episode. I have one tier of membership. It is $5 a month, patreon.com/JohnHuffPodcast, and I greatly appreciate all the people who have supported me so far. If you have thoughts about the direction of this show, if you have ideas about what you like best about it, what you think would be cool, drop me a line and tell me, man. I am open to suggestion on how we might move forward from here. I'm toying with some ideas. There's a certain amount of energy in them, certain amount of momentum in them. I'm going to explore them. I'm going to juggle them a little bit, and we'll see what happens. This is all a work in progress, as we all are, kids. Now, I could spend the next 20 minutes saying goodbye, trying to get this up to the magical 50 hour. I'm not going to do it because you and I right now today, kids, we are breaking our habits. We are breaking our attachments, all right? Next week, we'll have hopefully part 1 of Emily's new episode. It is really, really inspiring stuff. It's a really, really good conversation. I can say without hesitation that the energy was in that one, kids. And so far, the universe has not conspired to kibosh it. So tune in next week to catch the first part of my conversation with Emily Dolan Davis. In the meantime, go back to number 21. Listen to my first conversation with her. She is really an exciting story. Do yourself a favor. Skip over about the first 8 minutes where I did this. At the time, felt like a nice natural introduction. And now, 120 episodes later, 120 episodes better, I can listen to that and say, egad, dude, that was dreadful and boring. My persona has been somewhat amplified since then. It's embarrassing for me to listen to myself back in those days, but the interview itself is really, really good and sets the table very nicely for what's to come, because we basically picked up where we left off, and Emily has done some amazing and fabulous and exciting stuff since then. We're getting into some really heavy-duty, existential, personal stuff, some music stuff. It's really, really great. You're going to love it. In the meantime, thank you for coming this far. We'll be back next week with what will definitely be a much better episode. Thanks as always for listening. I do appreciate it. Good things happen when you put yourself out there, kids. Emily will demonstrate extraordinary proof of that next week. Until then, do take care of yourselves, and hey, I'll check you later. Yeah. Kisses, born desert sun. Really? A furball?